let's just trust the process and take one step at a time. And the step we'll be working on today is focusing on just making sure you have the basics of how you're going to be interacting with either your data or your human subjects down cold, so that we have, and then I will review your instruments as submitted. We will get things finalized. You'll have a plan of action that you can just go ahead and execute. It'll be beautiful. All right. Starting to sound more enthusiastic. We should be celebrating. Come on now, we're about to collect data. Come on, give me a D. All right. So maybe that exercise will actually perk me up a bit because there's not enough coffee in the world right now. So I know this is big and overwhelming, and unfortunately PowerPoint doesn't really allow you to separately animate rows on tables. But any method you're doing, who here is doing a systematic count-based analysis of content? Anyone? Content analysis. Anybody do something? Yep, I knew it. So, these are the questions that you'll be answering. You'll want a code book, something that talks about what you're counting, what you're measuring, and you're going to be asking, does it clarify or confuse someone who's reading it? That's one of the key questions. It's a little subjective, but you're trying to ensure that it's really clear. And if you were to cite a content analysis, that's a question you could ask of anybody's work. Then we're going to go into internal validity. There's different types of internal validity, but the basic question is, are they doing what they claim to be doing? Are they measuring what they claim to be measuring? You can have a really clear code book and you can be like, this label's crap. The way they're interpreting it is crap. You could still have those questions. Even if it's very clear and not confusing, you might still think it's not doing what it's intending to do. So you have the face validity, that's your subjective assessment of on its face. To use these weird English idioms that confuse international students on the face of it, is it doesn't make sense. Content, is it complete? Does it include everything you want if you were talking about that idea? Discriminant, are there things that just shouldn't be there? External validity. Is this codebook, whatever it's measuring, and even if it's measuring it clearly and correctly, does it only exist in your head as a researcher? It's not bad if it doesn't exist outside of being in your head as a researcher, but you need to acknowledge that. The people you're studying, or the content you're studying, the content you're studying in a communication context will impact people. People will see it, they will interact with it, it's intended to communicate something. If whatever it is that you're coding, and however it is that you've labeled it and defined it, would never be noticed by anybody who's on the receiving end of that communication, or would never be purposefully encoded in that content by the sender of that communication, then you might just think about, well, how relevant is whatever I'm looking at? So, for example, my student, she did her thesis on sexualization of female models and whether they appear to be minors or not. And she was like, I can't tell you what people, from my thesis, what people will see as sexualized. There could be a lot of variation there, right? But she decided to construct the categories in a way that actual legislators and people suing advertising companies, etc., could be like, this is actually a violation of law. Her parents were lawyers. So she got it down to what would reflect law to make it more externally valid. So that it wasn't just a subjective sense of sexualization, but had a more concrete, pinpointed, regulatable, however you say that, regulable, focus. So, but not everything will have it. I've done content analyses of instability on Reddit, and I don't expect everyone to see instability where I see it through the content analysis codebook. I don't expect that. I'm just trying to get an average level of whatever it is that I'm measuring it, which I'm labeling instability. I just want to see the rise and flow, maybe, or have moderation, because I assume that on average, 40% of people will see this as uncivil, and then will have impacts on the world. If you combine your content analysis with a study where people actually then react to the content, you really approach that external validity. pretty clearly because like I did a study where I content analyzed political tweets and then I showed them to real people and got their reactions. You know, the combined approach can really help. Now external reliability, that's this miscellaneous category for all these methods. It's all the things you can't control as a researcher that could interfere with your ability to measure accurately. So in one case, like your code book, you just want to see if two people can follow the instructions and actually reach the same conclusion. Because that tells you not only something about how clear your code book is, but it tells you something about like with all the stuff you can't control, like all those associations, linguistic associations, cultural associations, experiences that any particular person would bring to your code book. You can't control any of that, can you? So you want to see if two people with different experiences can follow that code book and reach the same conclusion. And then the last column is about sampling from a larger population. And for content, it's that population of content. So when I randomly sampled political tweets from Twitter right after Biden's election, around up till the January 6th riots, I didn't have necessarily a representation of the population, but I did at least randomly sample for 20,000 tweets. You know, so it wasn't representative, but it was diverse. It did come from a larger body. So these questions repeat for every method. Discourse analysis, anybody working with themes, analyzing themes based on survey data? Yeah, discourse analysis, you don't have a code book, but you're gonna have to have an analytic process. Why did you think that there were themes here? Can you describe it in a way that you build trust? That people are like, hey, these themes really are present, they're not just in your head. And they clearly know what they are. One way you'll do that is by maybe giving examples, etc. These are quotes from different people that I am categorizing under this theme. Internal validity. When a reader is looking over those themes, looking over the quotes you give, on the face of it, do those themes make sense in the label you've given it? Do they seem to completely represent whatever label you've given it? Is there anything there that a reader would be like, why did you include that? You can also address, for both of these, you can also address trouble cases, because that builds trust. If you're it was ambiguous whether this quote represents this theme or this theme, so I ultimately decided to categorize it in this way. That builds trust because any real researcher expects that ambiguity, so if you just ignore it, they're like, well, what are all these choices you're making that you're not telling me about? And the same questions repeat with things like, would anybody see these things but the researchers? And again, it's okay if your answer is no, but probably somebody would see those themes, right? If you're studying apology videos for racism on YouTube, then, which one of my students did, a good portion of the people watching those apology videos would be like, yeah, you're just blaming the fact that you wore blackface on your personal struggles rather than your inherent racism. A good number of people would see that, but a good number of people wouldn't see that. They'd be like, what are you complaining about? He's apologizing. You don't necessarily have a clear answer to that question, but the answer should be at least somebody would see it the way you see it. At least your readers by the end of the study, by the end of reading your thesis. And then external reliability. Most discourse analyses have multiple researchers. Now you may not be able to address that because you're not working with a partner, it's an independent project. And that's okay, but you can acknowledge that as a limitation. Every research project has limitations. And once again, whatever you're looking at, probably you have this very convenient sample, but you might be looking at speeches. You might be looking at something that you're actually trying to represent a larger, diverse social phenomenon, in which case you want to talk about, what are you not looking at? What did you not examine? How does what you examined relate to the larger body of content that's out there? These are the basic questions. They repeat across everything, which is why I've now put this on the overview page of all of the weeks. Got a question? Or no, just resting your arm. I get it. Yeah, so I do want to though focus us in before we launch into more of the details on, well, I guess we'll do the open-ended interviewing since many of you are doing that. So again, open-ended interviewing. Let's say I had, let's do a little test. We're gonna black out that row and then worth a shape. And then we're gonna see how much of what I've just been chuntering on, whatever that British phrase is. I've just been going on about how much of that you could actually address per open-ended interviewing, since so many of you are doing it. All right, internal reliability. How are you gonna assess internal reliability of your open-ended interviews?
This is like, you need to have the questions that are getting at the same thing in different ways.
Yes, clarifying what you're asking about so that you know that your measure is likely to get, so that someone who's independently evaluating your measure would be like, I think you're gonna get the information you're looking for. You're gonna measure something consistently. How about internal validity? I remember that has like 20 different parts, so let's break it down. Face validity. How are people going to assess the face validity of however you're describing your data?
I'm not sure, like, for this, what, like, labeling it means. Could you elaborate on that?
So that's a hard part, right? Because open-ended interviewing and meta-analysis is actually just going to put like this discourse text out together with the interview. So it's a little bit of a trick question. But you could still, if someone's reading over your survey, your interview questions, they're going to form ideas about what you're asking about, right? And you want to make sure that those ideas are clearly labeled so that they're convincingly labeled and they're convincingly derived from your literature review. They're part of, there's a flow from what other people have done to what you're asking about that makes sense to your reader.
Oh, okay.
So not only is it very clear what you're measuring, but it's clear why you're putting that label on it.
If that was like, if I like discussed concepts or like things in my like intro section and then basically just like used those ideas and made that the label, is that like right?
And that could, as long as you've convincingly discussed them so that your reader can like see that argumentation, buys into it, and then they'll be like, oh yeah, that's valid on its face. But they're still gonna ask like, okay, you asked 20 questions and now you're deriving themes, and are the themes complete? Are the themes including things that shouldn't go with that idea? They're still gonna be asking themselves those questions. They have fancy labels for like the research community, but they're intuitive, right? If you were reading over something, you'd be like, okay, if something was included under a theme, under a header that didn't seem to belong there, you'd be like, what? Like, the fact that we label that discriminative validity is not really, it just helps us to talk about it. You have that psychological experience, whatever is going on. So, external validity. What's the external validity question? It's for surveys and for interviews. What's the external validity question?
Like if we had someone else read through the interview responses and review the data, if like they would agree with the themes we discussed from that come out.
That's getting a little more into the external reliability question. The validity is about how much does the measurement context resemble the everyday world for your participants? So if you're asking them questions in an interview and you see them kind of making things up, you might observe nonverbal cues, or that they say verbally, I've never thought about that before. Their answers aren't going to be particularly externally valid because they've literally told you that they've never thought about that before. So you're going to have, it's not that that's useless information, but you're going to have to like say, well, it seems plausible. Their story they told on the spot seems plausible. And that might come up for you if you're asking about these teaching things, or if they're, might see, and sometimes they might even make something up. if they feel embarrassed that they've never thought about that before. I told you I was being interviewed and they asked me about this task report and I kind of semi-pretended to have read more of it than I had. Like, because I was on record, I didn't want to be embarrassed. So that will happen. Now, external reliability is absolutely about when somebody, but it's not only is it about when somebody see those same themes, but if somebody else was asking the questions, would they get different results? That's an interesting question, right? External reliability is the big miscellaneous category. So the clearest example I can always give is if you had a team of researchers, let's say there were 3 researchers, one of European descent, one of African descent, one of Asian descent, and you were studying race, you would probably get very different interview contexts, even if you had exactly the same questions, because those things will influence the way your participant responds. So that could even lead to bias, but it could also just lead to sort of random variation in the flow of that interview that's not necessarily controllable. Gender, all of these things that you just are aware that if you were in a different position, if you had a different skin color, a different presentation of your gender, a different age, a different height, all of those things could potentially influence the rapport that you're going through. And those are factors you can't control and factors that could have some influence. So you're just aware of that. You're just aware of those presence, those things that could interact with the responses you get to your questions. And then representativeness, no one doing an interview is going to have a representative sample. You might have a census if you're doing a small group and interviewing everybody, but you're not going to have a representative sample. It's going to be a convenient sample. And that's okay, because you're going in depth rather than talking to like 1,000 people, because you don't have time for that. Though, thinking about the student who's working with like Orange Theory instructors, you could end up talking to maybe half of the instructors in any particular Orange Theory, but you know, they still might not represent instructors in other gyms, or whatever you call them. All right, so let's just go quickly to surveys. I'm gonna copy over this block. And I forget, is anybody here planning to have some experimental manipulations? I don't think we have any experiments. All right, now internal reliability with surveys. First of all, what's the general concept that's supposed to be captured there?
In the block.
Internal reliability, like how do you assess it for surveys, generally?
Like the data? Like
Yeah, you get your survey data,
like Cronbach's alpha.
Cronbach's alpha, but what does Cronbach's alpha capture? What does it mean? You don't have to be too specific. Generally, what is it trying to tell you?
Does that mean that you're actually testing what you're trying to test, or is that something else? Is that internal validity?
That's more of the validity, but you're testing something consistently. It's a measure of consistency. And why would you ask someone multiple questions on a survey about the same idea? Why would you even do that?
Because like one question for one person could mean something else, but like if you have multiple questions meaning the same idea, they'll end up with at least one of them for each person.
Yes, all of those uncontrollable differences in interpretation and like emphasis and subtle differences, they balance out across questions. That's the whole point. Cronbach's alpha is a measure of the shared variation, which you don't need to know as a statistical concept, but you do need to have the idea. It's everything that was in common when people were answering those questions. I always give the example of the need for Cognition Scale, which was originally 24 questions, and they got it down to 6. But one of the questions is really weird, although it seems to be pretty good. Need for cognition, need to think about things. I like to deliberate hard and for long hours. Now, would anybody here predicted that would be a good question? But what I suspect is going on is it keeps being a good question statistically. What I suspect is going on is that the word deliberate, if you're a thinker in an English language setting, you tend to know that word. And if you're not a thinker, you're just like, I don't know. What the hell are you asking about? So I think that is not the best designed survey question, but I suspect that's why it keeps like explaining a lot of the need for cognition for people. Now internal validity is, are you measuring what you claim to be measuring? Whatever it is you're measuring consistently, are you labeling it appropriately? And you can also ask questions about, again, about completeness and about whether it seems like maybe there's like several, what they call subscales of what you're talking about. Like maybe you're actually talking about 3 different closely related things that are all a little bit different. And that's just something you have to think about. There's a good example I use in my social media class. It's the problematic internet use scale, and it has a lot of things you'd expect to ask about, like I feel lost without social media, or I use it impulsively. But they also have a weird set of 3 questions in this 15-question scale, which are like, I prefer online to offline interactions. And that seems to fail the discriminative validity test, right? Because guess what? There's nothing inherently wrong with that depending on the quality of your offline environment, right? Like, or your level of social anxiety, right? It's not necessarily problematic at all. So it fails the discriminative validity, even though, and you add all these questions together and you take their average of people's responses, it actually has a pretty high Promax alpha. Like, it is true that a lot of people who are compulsive about their online use, who feel distracted by social media, who feel drawn to it, feel lost without it. A lot of them also have problems offline, but you're actually kind of combining the cause with the effect in that survey. If you have poor offline relationships, that could lead you to try and get your needs met online, but it's not shouldn't necessarily be part of the survey itself. So you're gonna encounter those issues, maybe with your own work, and certainly maybe in the works of people you're citing. So that's just something to keep in mind. So then the external validity question is the same as we just talked about for interviews. I got 5,000 steps. Okay. It's I got 20,000 yesterday. Teaching gives you your steps. So external validity, if you're asking questions that people would never have thought about before, like the word deliberate in that scale, then you might have very low external validity. And again, that can be okay, but if they're really making it up on the spot, then you gotta think carefully about that. External reliability, well, usually the survey's administered over a computer, so you don't have to worry about who is giving you the survey. But in the modern day, but the scenario, the setting might matter. Are they taking it with their kids screaming in the background? Are they taking it on a sunny day where they're in a better mood? Are they taking it on a cloudy day? These are all factors that's hard to control. So you want to collect enough people that kind of balances out over time. All the people who got a little mood boost are balanced out by all the people who have seen storm clouds all morning. You just want to have balance. All the people who are high as hell, and you will get people taking your studies high on occasion, are balanced out by the people who are hyper caffeinated, are balanced out by the people who are about to fall asleep. Like, you just have to collect enough people to balance across those factors. But you can at least be aware of them and think about them. And then representativeness, nobody here has the money to do a representative survey because you would have to randomly recruit from your population, unless you're doing a very small population survey, population study. So it's going to be a convenient sample once again. In fact, out of this representativeness question, probably only for very specific types of content analysis will any of you be able to approach representativeness. And even then, that's difficult for most types of content you want to look at. So you don't even have to think about it, but you can acknowledge this limitation. Alright, so how much of that got you thinking in a way that can be helpful to you?